So logistics is about a lot of things, right? We talked about freight movement. You've heard that pretty clearly from Kerry's comments and some of the things that Georgia's been working on for some time now. Logistics and freight movement is in our DNA here in Georgia. We've covered trucks pretty comprehensively, and the guru for truck transportation in the state, if you have questions, and hopefully you will later, Ed is a wealth of knowledge. I wanted to take a little bit of a step back to Marcia's point. You know, logistics, you saw the job numbers and the impact that trucking has. Logistics is about a lot of different things. It is about economic development, and I'll use a slide here in a minute to represent that. Sustainable, competitive, to build on your plug, it's also the theme for our summit coming up in February. We did have about 1,300 people there from 21 different states that were here actually at this facility and next door at the Galleria to learn about what's going on in logistics. It's more than Georgia. Logistics and freight moves, as you saw from these maps that Ed warned you you're going to have nightmares about, all over the country. But we're doing a lot of things to help move that freight and make it get to where it wants to go, cost effectively, securely, efficiently, and so on. So I wanted to touch on that and really not show you too many maps, but talk about where this freight is coming from and why it's coming to the state of Georgia and why it wants to come here. And really the two hubs, the Port of Savannah and our air cargo hubs here in the Atlanta area are two of those main nodes that I'll touch on. And then I'll try to go through this quickly because I have a few slides, and then we'll maybe answer questions afterwards. So to take a step all the way back, what is logistics? Logistics, supply chain, freight movement, you can use a lot of different words to describe that, and there's a lot of definitions for it. I challenge you to go Google it like I do. My military background, I like Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War, says the line between disorder and order lies in logistics. And that is true, and the companies that it works with will probably tell you some stories about that too. You can read the more verbose definition of supply chain management from one of the associations that's out there, but the one that I use most often is that it's really about moving stuff from point A to point B. Right, and that stuff can be people, and we talk about transit and high-speed rail and commuter rail and others, lots of projects there. Or we can talk about moving freight and goods and commerce, and that's really what we focus on as a center for the state. But there's a lot of dots that need to be connected, as you can see in that little dot line at the bottom there, to move that stuff from point A to point B. And it uses a lot of different modes. You saw pretty clearly from Ed's slides that a lot of it leading that fight is the trucking industry, but it also moves by rail and by our seaports and also by air cargo as well. And they are very well connected. And we need a connected network to be able to move that freight efficiently and securely and cost effectively. And I'll show you a few things around that too. But at the end of the day, every supply chain is unique, right? I mean, we move a lot of different products to a lot of different places to a lot of different people. If you can see that picture in the top corner, that's not how we move poultry anymore. We're putting it on trucks more now than ever. As a matter of fact, we're exporting about 40% of the nation's supply of poultry goes out of the Port of Savannah every year. But for a guy who runs an innovation center around logistics, it's about doing the best with what you have, right, a lot of times. And in these times, in these economic times specifically, we've got to be creative. I don't have all the answers. I don't think anybody does. But we do know that we have to be creative, and we've got to do things differently than we've ever done before. And I challenge you to help us do that in the world of logistics. At the end of the day, it's about money. And bottom line is logistics impacts revenue for companies. 10% is a very, very conservative number. If you look at the biomass industry and some of the pharmaceuticals and things that we move in trucks and trains and other modes every day, it can get up to 40 or 50% of total sales and revenue can go to freight transportation and logistics costs for any particular company. In the state of Georgia, we have about 1 million people that are directly employed. This is not a model. This is a totally Excel column sort of number. About 1 million people that are involved in the logistics industry. You've heard a couple different numbers for different modes. But about 1 million people that are either waking up every day providing a logistics service or using that service to fuel their business. They're logistics-enabled companies. So it's a big part of logistics ecosystem and our economic development efforts here in Georgia. Where are they located? Not to hurt your eyes, but if you squint and tilt your head a little bit, you can see some clusters, which resonate with some of those freight clusters that Kerry showed you earlier. Definitely in Savannah, definitely in Augusta, and really sprinkled around the state. The question I like to ask is, why are there not more dots in some of these other counties? Is it a policy issue? Is it an infrastructure issue? What are some of the challenges that are keeping more dots to be located in more locations around our state? And those are things that we look at with the state government and with other private industry companies every day. But about 11,000 different companies that make up our ecosystem. And an interesting statistic to build on Ed's comments around trucks, about 81% from the numbers we have, about 81% of the trucking industry has less than 5 employees. So small businesses are indeed fueling trucking and logistics here in Georgia as well. From an economic development point of view, this is just from fiscal year 2011. You don't need to memorize these, but we had about 33 projects that are involved, announcements that were involved in logistics or were fueled by logistics, about 1,400 jobs and $240 million worth of investment. Again, not a model, but a total of the Excel column type figure here in Georgia in economic development. And I can tell you, over the past few months, it's gotten even better. We can add more jobs and more investment here in our state fueled by logistics. A few good news items. We were talking a little bit before with some folks about there is a lot of good news out there, and Georgia definitely has some to share. I've got a few of these that I'll just click through quickly. The Pew Center put out a report just a few months ago that talked about jobs and commerce, and it's about as close as I've ever seen as somebody talking about logistics and economic development from a think tank type group like the Pew Center. But what struck me was Georgia was the only state in the Southeast that was ranked. You can see the sort of the colors there. Green is leading the way in jobs and commerce in the Southeast, and one of only 13 states in the nation that are leading the way overall, and they measured about 9 different areas of competitiveness from the states around the nation. So we've got some things to be proud of, and things that we can share for the states in our neighboring areas there. Similarly, CNBC did a Best States for Business, and I just highlighted a few of these, and you can get these reports online. Number 2 in logistics, and this is pretty common. Area Site Selection Magazine ranked our infrastructure top 1 and 2 for best places to do business as well. And then finally, the U.S. Chamber looked at enterprising states and how they're growing, and one of the things, again, connected to logistics was our export market share is growing by leaps and bounds, and now number 6 in the nation. And that report specifically cited the Department of Economic Development and some of the leadership around the state and the governor's competitiveness initiative to help drive some of those factors also. So at the end of the day, it's about supply and demand, right, to use another logistics term. But to put that in context, it's really about, do we here in Georgia, and do we really as a nation, have the supply of infrastructure? You can substitute supply of workforce as well. But do we have the supply of infrastructure to meet the demand of the future freight that is coming our way? You saw some of the projections that Ed showed, and it is indeed coming, and I'll give you some more details about that. But do we have that supply of infrastructure to meet the demand? It's not about today. It's about what's coming here. We're okay now, but if we rest on our laurels, we will not have that supply of infrastructure and a lot of other things to meet that demand of future freight. That freight's coming, and it's going somewhere. We want it to come here to Georgia and create more of the jobs and the investment that I showed you previously. So where is that coming from? Really, that supply of infrastructure, it deals with these 3 C's, and I like to do this as an engineer, put 3 letters, and my staff knows this too. Do we have the capacity? Do we have the capability? And do we have the connectivity to handle that future freight? And I'll just quickly go through this. Capacity, we've got more coming. Do we have enough to handle those volumes? That's going to be multimodal. We saw the increase in intermodal rail being one of those. The capability, that capacity and that new infrastructure has unique requirements. If you look at rail, can we double stack trains? Do we have the right weight limits on our trucks to be able to have the right capabilities to move that freight as cost effectively and efficiently as possible? Because if we don't, it's going to go somewhere else that does, meaning another state. And then finally, the connectivity, and this is really linking together, and I'll call them unfair advantages here in a minute, but do we have the connectivity to link together those nodes that are generating a lot of this freight? You saw the ports and our airports and our population here in Atlanta that's driving a lot of that. And again, we have to link that together because that's where that cargo wants to go. If it was water, that's where it would flow. And we've got to do that across multiple modes. It's not just about trucking, and Ed knows this and talks about it often. It's about connecting together those multiple nodes and making sure it's efficient as possible. And also, and I put in parentheses there, again, it's not about just our nodes today, but where are those future hubs and future nodes going to be around the state of Georgia that are going to generate even more freight into our system? We have some unfair advantages, and I won't read these all to you. If you don't know about how big our seaports are, I'm going to tell you, but you've probably been asleep at the wheel if you haven't heard some of the news that's come out recently. But our roads, top ranked, I mentioned that in some of these national reports I just showed you. Most extensive rail network in the U.S., and the list goes on and on. Nationally, and I don't know the algorithm for this, but nationally, by the year 2050, we're going to add about 100 million people into our nation, roughly. And the math shows that every one of us puts about 40 tons of freight into the system. So on top of what's already on our relatively congested network throughout the nation, we're going to add about 4 billion more tons of cargo. Goes back to my supply and demand thing. Do we have the supply of infrastructure to meet those demands as a nation? And what is Georgia doing to meet those demands here locally? So a lot of good questions there, but it is indeed a lot of freight that we want to come here to create those jobs and the investments. Right now, Georgia road freight, this is just trucking. These are a couple years old, but and these are hard numbers to get your head around. But the value of freight flow on the trucking side, about $1.5 trillion of cargo moving in, out, and through our state every year. 570 million tons and 53 million truck moves moving around. Well, what does that look like? Well, similar to Ed's map, it's going all over the place. And what you can't really see there are the smaller orange lines, which isn't the best color, but it is indeed flowing all over the state of Georgia, and no surprises on where some of those thicker lines are located. We can do better. We're pretty well balanced as an import-export state, and I'll get into that in a second, but we've still got a lot of empty movements. Air is one of the most expensive things to ship when you look at freight transportation, whether it's by truck or rail. And by truck, we're still moving about 12 million empty moves just within the walls or the boundaries of our state every year. That's not going to completely go away, but we can do a lot more to put money into the pockets of those truck drivers if we can balance those loads and not have empty moves moving around our state. So there's things we can work on there as well. We've also got a lot of rail flow. This is actually a very current map of where our rail tonnage is moving. It's a smaller share, obviously, as Ed pointed out too, of the overall tonnage, but indeed flowing all over the United States and all over Georgia to help move that product as efficiently as possible when appropriate. I personally don't want to live next to a railhead, so there will always, again, be trucks on the roads, but better connected to our rail network as well. So just a couple of quick slides. Again, on the Ports Authority, as one of those generating nodes of freight, we've been growing faster than any other port in the country as a seaport down in Savannah for the past 10 years or so. And if you look back, combined annual growth rates, you can look at the numbers and look at some of our neighboring states that are not faring quite as well. A lot of reasons why that I won't get into now, but we are definitely attracting a lot of freight that's going to get on our network every day. This is a new slide. It was in the paper recently. Just recently, we took over as the number 2 port in the country for exports. And if we look at where jobs and investment comes from as a nation, exports are driving a lot of that. And only behind Los Angeles is the only other port in the country that's moving more tons on the export side, sending our products manufactured or generated here in the U.S. To other parts of the world. So we're pretty proud of that. Intermodal rail volumes, I won't belabor this, has grown about 200% over the past 10 years, and that matches up with Ed's slide as well for that integration between rail and trucks. Where do we go from here? Just one slide, the port right now, and this is very, very conservative. If we only grow at about 5%, if I go back to that other slide, we've been doing it at about 11%, so contradicting my slide here, but we're going to need new capacity. We're going to need new supply of infrastructure. One of the projects, and I can answer questions about this later, is the new Jasper terminal, which is about 15 or 20 years away, but will be needed if you look at that first dotted line when the Garden City Seaport, the container terminal, maxes out at capacity. Where do we go from there? After 2020, where do those containers go to? We're going to need new supply of infrastructure, and we need to begin to plan for that now. And I can answer more about that later. Really quickly, if I got 2 minutes, I wanted to give you one big game changer. And if you haven't heard about the Panama and the Panama Canal, it is what is going to fuel a lot of this growth. And some of you, I see a few nodding heads, people have heard this before. But back in 1855, and I won't bore you with a history lesson, but give you a taste because it is pretty interesting, in my opinion. But 1855, we added a new railroad to help move cargo across the country of Panama to get it from California over to the East Coast and a lot of other places. And then they converted that railroad into a ditch filled with water, right? And they called it the Panama Canal. And that's my short version of the Panama Canal's history. But 1914, as an example, though, these ships and the way this canal was designed, containerization wasn't even close to being a practice, wasn't even a thought. So the idea of a square rectangular box wasn't used in the shipping industry at all. And the size of the vessels that were designed to transverse this canal were much, much smaller. And in the last 100 years, they haven't changed the Panama Canal at all. So in 2014, and before I say that, about 1 million transits have gone through during that period between 1914 and 2011. But for their 100th year anniversary in 2014, they're adding a third set of locks, bringing it up to the 19th century as far as new technology. Larger vessels will be able to transverse. Why do we care? We know a lot of that cargo is going to be coming to the East Coast. They're going to be bringing much larger vessels to where that cargo wants to go, here to the East Coast and particularly to Georgia. We could talk about the new volumes, but again, like I showed you in one of my first slides, it's about the bottom line of the dollar, right? What these two slides, I'm going to flip back and forth between them. Right now, the current vessels, which are 4,000 container vessels that come to the East Coast, this is cargo that comes to the West Coast but wants to go to Atlanta, wants to come to the East Coast. We're only cost competitive about 46% of the time. Okay, well, that's about half. You figure we're okay, which means that that cargo is being railed across the United States into our East Coast. If we go to when we deepen the Panama Canal, we add these new locks, we go to 8,000 TEU vessels or 8,000 container ships, and we can see for the first time now that cargo that wants to come to the East Coast, for the first time in the history of the nation, the East Coast is now more competitive than the West Coast. And I know that's a lot to digest, but companies like the Home Depot and others know this, and they're going to be using these all-water routes through the Panama Canal to move more cargo to the East Coast and through our ports. Are we ready? Are we going to have the supply to meet this demand just from a cost perspective? A lot of other factors, but just from a cost perspective, do we have the infrastructure to handle this? We will, and we're planning for that now. And that trend has been going on for quite some time, where the all-water routes have been more competitive, and with no improvements in the infrastructure, I'm getting my cue, with no improvements in the infrastructure of the Panama Canal, they've been dominating the market share as well. Thank you.